My friends, I want to begin today with a memory of my own grandfather, a quiet, deeply respected man in our community who rarely spoke more than a few sentences at any given family gathering, and yet whose opinion, whenever he did finally offer it, carried more weight in our family than anyone else's lengthy speeches ever managed to achieve. As a younger man, I misunderstood his silence entirely. I assumed he simply had less to say than the rest of us, that his quietness reflected a limited inner life rather than a deliberate, hard-won discipline. It was only much later, well into my own 60s, that I finally understood how profoundly wrong this assumption had been. I began to understand my grandfather's silence differently the day my own father, his son, told me something during a difficult family dispute I have never forgotten. He said that his own father, my grandfather, had once told him plainly that the wisest people he had ever known throughout his long life were not the ones who said the most, but the ones who had learned, often through considerable painful experience, exactly which things were better left unsaid entirely. I carried this second-hand wisdom with me for decades without fully understanding its depth, until my own life, particularly the years following my 60th birthday, taught me directly and repeatedly exactly what my grandfather had likely meant. I want to share with you today 7 specific things I have noticed, across my own life and in watching the genuinely wise older people I have been fortunate to know, that these particular people consistently choose to keep silent about, not out of secrecy, dishonesty, or coldness, but out of a hard-earned wisdom about what speaking aloud actually accomplishes versus what it costs. This is not a lesson about becoming withholding, evasive, or emotionally distant from the people you love. It is a lesson about a very particular kind of discernment, developed slowly and often painfully across many decades, regarding which truths genuinely benefit from being spoken, and which are better carried quietly, held with dignity rather than voiced simply because they happen to be true. The first thing, they stay silent about their own unsolicited opinions of their adult children's choices. I want to begin with what I believe is the single most common and most difficult silence practiced by genuinely wise older people, precisely because it concerns the people we love most intensely and about whom we often feel the strongest, most passionate convictions. A wise older friend of mine, a woman who raised 5 children of her own, told me that she holds strong private opinions about nearly every major decision each of her adult children has made over the past several decades, opinions she almost never voices unless directly and genuinely asked. She explained to me that she learned this particular silence the hard way, through a painful stretch in her 50s when her persistent, unsolicited commentary about her eldest daughter's marriage nearly cost her the relationship entirely. She had believed, at the time, that voicing her concerns represented genuine love and honest guidance, the responsibility of a devoted mother who could see clearly what her daughter, blinded by love, could not yet see for herself. What she discovered instead was that this unsolicited commentary, however well-intentioned, communicated primarily distrust in her daughter's own judgment, creating a distance between them that took years of careful repair to fully heal. Since that painful lesson, she has practiced a considerably different approach, holding her genuine opinions privately unless her children explicitly ask for them, and even then, offering these opinions with considerable restraint and clear acknowledgement that the final decision genuinely belongs to them alone. This silence, she told me, has not diminished her closeness with her children in the slightest. If anything, her adult children now seek her counsel considerably more often precisely because they trust she will not use their vulnerability as an invitation to impose her own agenda upon their choices. The silence itself, practiced consistently over years, became the very foundation of a trust that constant commentary had once been quietly eroding. She shared with me one particular practice she developed to help maintain this discipline during moments of strong private disagreement. Whenever she felt the urge to voice an unsolicited opinion rising in her, she would ask herself a single question before speaking. Has this person actually asked for my view, or am I simply assuming they need to hear it? She told me that in the vast majority of cases, honestly answering this question revealed that no genuine invitation to comment had actually been extended, and recognizing this clearly, in the moment, made the choice to remain silent considerably easier than it had been during her earlier years of more impulsive commentary. The second thing, they stay silent about the full extent of their own health struggles. The second silence I have observed consistently among genuinely wise older people concerns the full details of their own declining health, shared selectively and deliberately rather than volunteered constantly and completely to everyone in their lives. I want to be clear that this is not a silence born of denial or unhealthy avoidance. The wise older people I have observed practicing this particular restraint are often quite honest and direct with their doctors and closest confidants about their genuine health concerns. What they withhold is the constant, detailed narration of every ache, every worry, every minor symptom to every person they encounter in daily life. An old friend of mine, a retired physician himself, described watching many of his own patients over the decades fall into a pattern of what he called chronic symptom broadcasting, sharing every minor health complaint with anyone who would listen, family, friends, even casual acquaintances at the grocery store. He observed that this pattern, while understandable given the genuine discomforts of aging, gradually transformed these particular patients' social identities almost entirely into their list of ailments, narrowing their conversations and their relationships considerably as friends and family began quietly avoiding extended interactions that had come to feel emotionally exhausting. He described making a deliberate choice, once his own health began presenting genuine challenges in his 70s, to share the full details only with his wife and his own doctor, offering everyone else in his life a brief, honest but limited acknowledgement when directly asked, followed quickly by a genuine redirection of the conversation towards something else entirely. This particular silence, he told me, protected not only his relationships from becoming narrowly focused on his declining health, but also protected his own sense of identity from narrowing in the same way, allowing him to remain, in his own mind and in the minds of everyone around him, a fully dimensional person rather than simply a collection of accumulating medical concerns. He also shared with me something I found particularly striking about how this restraint affected his own internal experience of his health struggles, separate from its effect on his relationships. He noticed that the constant narration of his symptoms to others, when he had still practiced it, seemed to reinforce and even amplify his own awareness of these symptoms throughout the day, as though describing his discomfort repeatedly kept it more persistently present in his own mind than it might otherwise have been. Once he began limiting this narration considerably, he noticed a subtle but genuine reduction in how frequently his own attention returned to his physical complaints throughout an ordinary day, suggesting that this particular silence served his own peace of mind, not merely the comfort of the people listening to him. The third thing, they stay silent about comparisons between the grandchildren or adult children. The third silence I have observed consistently among genuinely wise older people concerns the private comparisons they inevitably make, as any honest person naturally does, between their various children or grandchildren, comparisons that wise elders learn never to voice aloud regardless of how strongly they might privately feel them. A woman I know well, grandmother to 11 grandchildren across 3 different families, admitted to me privately that she naturally notices considerable differences in temperament, achievement, and behavior among her many grandchildren, exactly as any attentive grandmother would. She explained that early in her grandmothering years, she occasionally voiced these comparisons aloud, praising one grandchild's academic achievement within earshot of another struggling in school, or remarking on one grandchild's more even temperament compared to a more difficult sibling. She discovered, through the hurt feelings and subtle resentments that followed these seemingly innocent remarks, that children absorbed these comparisons far more deeply and permanently than adults often realize, carrying the sting of an offhand comment for years or even decades afterward. Since recognizing this pattern, she has practiced a strict and deliberate silence regarding any comparison between her grandchildren, offering praise and encouragement to each one individually and privately rather than in comparative terms relative to their siblings or cousins. This silence, maintained consistently over many years, has allowed each of her grandchildren to feel genuinely, individually valued by her, without the shadow of comparison that her earlier, more casual remarks had occasionally cast across these relationships. She told me this particular silence required considerable ongoing discipline, since the comparisons themselves arise naturally and constantly in her own private thoughts, but the practice of simply never voicing them aloud has protected relationships she considers among the most precious of her entire life. She offered me one additional insight about this particular practice that I found genuinely useful. She said that she had learned to redirect her own private comparative thoughts, the moment she noticed them arising, toward a more specific appreciation of whichever individual grandchild she happened to be with at the time, actively naming to herself some particular quality unique to that child rather than allowing the comparison to fully form in her mind at all. This small internal redirection, practiced consistently over time, gradually reduced how often the comparisons arose in the first place, making the external silence considerably easier to maintain than if she had continued privately dwelling on these comparisons even while outwardly declining to voice them. The fourth thing, they stay silent about old family conflicts and grievances in front of the younger generation. The fourth silence I have observed among genuinely wise older people concerns old family conflicts, grievances, and resentments from decades past, which they consciously choose not to air in front of grandchildren or younger family members, even when directly asked about difficult family history. An elderly man I came to know well, patriarch of a large extended family with a genuinely complicated history of old rifts and unresolved tensions among his own siblings, describe a deliberate decision he made in his own 60s to stop relitigating these old grievances in front of his grandchildren, regardless of how strongly he still privately felt about the original disputes. He explained that he had watched, in earlier decades, how casually voicing old family grievances in front of younger relatives tended to recruit these younger family members into taking sides in disputes that predated their own births by decades, disputes that genuinely had nothing to do with them and that his voicing them only served to perpetuate unnecessarily into a new generation. He recognized that his own continued airing of these old grievances, however emotionally satisfying in the moment, was effectively passing down resentments that might otherwise have eventually faded with his own generation, extending their lifespan artificially through his own repeated retelling. Since making this deliberate choice, he has practiced discussing family history with his grandchildren in far more neutral, generous terms, acknowledging genuine complexity and difficulty without assigning clear villains or relitigating old disputes in any detail. This silence, he told me, has allowed his grandchildren to form their own independent, generally warmer relationships with various extended family members, relationships that his own continued grievance airing might otherwise have poisoned before they had ever even properly begun. He described this particular restraint as one of the more difficult disciplines he has practiced in his later years, precisely because the old hurts themselves remain genuinely real and, in some cases, still privately unresolved even now. He told me one particular story that illustrated why he had ultimately committed to this practice so firmly. Years earlier, before adopting this discipline, he had once vented at length to a visiting grandchild about a decades-old dispute with an uncle the child barely knew, only to watch that same grandchild treat the uncle coldly at a family gathering months later, having absorbed his grandfather's old grievance as though it was somehow her own inheritance to carry forward. Witnessing this second-hand transmission of a resentment that predated her birth by decades troubled him deeply, and it was this specific incident, more than any abstract principle, that finally convinced him to practice the silence he has maintained ever since. The fifth thing, they stay silent about their own regrets regarding choices their children are currently repeating. The fifth silence I have observed among genuinely wise older people concerns their own private regrets about choices from their own younger years, particularly when they notice their own adult children beginning to make remarkably similar choices in their own lives. A woman I know well, who deeply regretted prioritizing her career over more time with her own young children decades earlier, described watching her own daughter, now a young mother herself, beginning to make strikingly similar choices in her own demanding career. She told me that her immediate impulse, upon recognizing this pattern, was to speak up urgently, hoping to spare her daughter the same regret she herself had carried privately for decades. But she paused, recognizing something important before speaking. Her daughter's circumstances, however superficially similar, were not actually identical to her own decades-old situation, shaped by an entirely different economic reality, a different marriage dynamic, and different personal values that her daughter alone was genuinely positioned to weigh and judge for herself. She recognized, too, that voicing her regret directly risked her daughter interpreting the comment as a judgment on her own current choices, rather than the gift of hard-won wisdom she genuinely intended to offer. She chose instead to share her own story honestly, when a natural occasion arose, simply as her own experience and her own feelings about it, without any explicit instruction attached regarding what her daughter should do differently. She told her daughter plainly, on one occasion, that she wished she had made different choices herself, and left the story there, trusting her daughter to draw her own conclusions rather than pressing the comparison further or repeating the concern insistently in subsequent conversations. This particular restraint, offering the story once honestly rather than repeating the warning insistently, allowed her daughter to genuinely absorb the reflection on her own terms, without the defensive resistance that repeated, urgent warnings so often provoke in anyone receiving them. She reflected, too, on an important distinction she had come to recognize between sharing a regret as information her daughter was free to use however she wished, versus sharing it as a directive her daughter was expected to follow. The first approach, she discovered, respected her daughter's full autonomy as an adult capable of weighing her own circumstances, while the second approach, however lovingly intended, subtly implied that her daughter's judgment could not be trusted without her mother's ongoing intervention. Learning to offer her hard-won wisdom in the spirit of the first approach, and to release any attachment to whether her daughter ultimately acted on it, became the true heart of this particular silence. The sixth thing, they stay silent about their own financial details with extended family. The sixth silence I have observed among genuinely wise older people concerns the specific details of their own financial circumstances, particularly with extended family members beyond their immediate spouse and, in some cases, their own adult children. A retired businessman I know well described learning this particular silence through a painful experience in his own 60s, when a distant relative, having learned considerable details about his financial situation through casual family conversation, began making increasingly presumptuous requests for financial assistance based on an inflated assumption of his available resources. He described the discomfort of navigating these escalating requests, and the family tension that followed his eventual, necessary refusals, tension he came to believe could have been avoided entirely had he simply maintained greater privacy about his financial circumstances from the outset. Since this experience, he has practiced considerable discretion regarding financial specifics with anyone beyond his immediate family, offering only the vaguest general impressions when financial subjects arise in broader family conversation, and directing any genuine financial planning discussions exclusively to his spouse, his own children when directly relevant, and his professional financial advisors. This particular silence, he told me, has spared him considerable family tension and awkward positioning in the years since, allowing his relationships with extended family to remain warm and uncomplicated by financial expectation or presumption. He acknowledged that this restraint occasionally required deflecting curious or probing questions from relatives with practiced, good-humored vagueness, a small social skill he had needed to develop deliberately, but one that he considered a small price for the protection this particular privacy afforded both his finances and his family relationships more broadly. He also noted an interesting secondary benefit of this particular discretion that he had not anticipated when he first adopted it. By declining to discuss financial specifics with extended family, he found that conversations naturally shifted toward genuinely more personal and meaningful subjects, family memories, current activities, and honest catching up, rather than remaining anchored around the somewhat transactional territory that financial discussion tends to invite. He came to believe that this particular silence had inadvertently deepened the quality of his extended family relationships, simply by removing a subject that had previously consumed a disproportionate share of their limited time together. The seventh thing, they stay silent about their genuine fear of death, except with their most trusted confidants. The seventh and final silence I want to describe to you today concerns perhaps the deepest and most universal fear carried by anyone in their later years, the genuine fear of death and dying, which wise older people generally choose to discuss openly only with their most trusted confidants, rather than broadcasting freely to everyone in their daily lives. This is not a silence born of shame or denial, but rather a recognition, hard-earned through experience, that this particular fear, voiced too casually or too frequently to people not equipped to hold it well, tends to produce discomfort and distance rather than the genuine comfort and connection the person voicing it is actually seeking. A close friend of mine, a widow in her late 70s who has grown remarkably comfortable discussing her own mortality in appropriate contexts, described learning through experience precisely which relationships could hold this particular subject well and which could not. She discovered that casual acquaintances and even certain family members, however well-intentioned, often responded to her honest expressions of mortality-related fear with visible discomfort, hurried reassurance, or an abrupt change of subject, responses that left her feeling more isolated with her fear rather than genuinely comforted by having voiced it. She described gradually learning to reserve these particular, deeply vulnerable conversations for her closest sister, her longtime pastor, and a small grief support group she had joined following her husband's passing, relationships and settings specifically equipped to hold this weighty subject with the genuine presence it required. With everyone else in her life, she maintains a more general, matter-of-fact acknowledgement of her own mortality when the subject naturally arises, without delving into the deeper layers of fear she reserves for her most trusted few. This particular discernment, she told me, was not about hiding her fear from the world, but about honoring both her own genuine need to voice this fear authentically and the genuine limitations of most relationships to hold something this weighty without strain, directing her most vulnerable disclosures only toward the relationships genuinely capable of receiving them well. She shared one final reflection with me that I found particularly moving. She said that learning to distinguish between relationships equipped to hold this fear and relationships that were not had actually deepened her gratitude for the few relationships that could, precisely because she no longer took their capacity for granted or assumed it should be available from everyone in her life. Her sister, her pastor, and her grief group had become, in her words, genuinely sacred spaces specifically because she protected them from being diluted by constant, casual mention of a fear that deserved to be received with full presence rather than passing acknowledgement. My friends, I want to be clear that none of these 7 silences I have described to you today represent dishonesty, secrecy, or emotional withholding in any troubling sense. Every wise older person I have described to you remains deeply honest, deeply connected, and deeply present with the people they love. What distinguishes their silence from mere avoidance or coldness is a very particular kind of discernment, developed slowly across many decades of genuine experience, about which truths, spoken aloud in a given moment to a given person, genuinely serve love and connection, and which truths, however factually accurate, primarily serve only the speaker's own momentary impulse to be heard, regardless of the cost to the relationship receiving them. I think it is worth saying plainly that developing this particular discernment took every single person I have described to you today considerable time and, in most cases, at least one genuinely painful experience of speaking when silence would have served considerably better. I do not believe this wisdom typically arrives through abstract contemplation alone. It arrives, for most of us, through the hard evidence of relationships strained or damaged by words spoken too freely, evidence that eventually teaches even the most naturally forthcoming among us the genuine value of a well-chosen silence. I want to offer one final thought that ties these 7 particular silences together more clearly. In every single case I have described to you today, the silence itself was never about withholding love. It was, in every instance, a more sophisticated expression of love than the original impulse to speak had been, a love mature enough to consider the actual likely effect of a truth on its intended recipient, rather than simply the speaker's own immediate desire for release or validation in voicing it. This distinction, between speaking to unburden yourself and speaking because the other person genuinely benefits from hearing it, may be the single clearest test I know for discerning when silence, rather than honesty, is the wiser and more loving choice in any given moment. If you are watching this today and you recognize, in your own life, a tendency to voice certain truths freely simply because they happen to be true, without first pausing to consider whether voicing them in this particular moment, to this particular person, genuinely serves the relationship you value, I want you to know that developing this discernment is available to you at any age, and that the silences I have described today are not acts of withholding love, but rather some of the deepest, most considered acts of love that genuine wisdom in our later years has to offer. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. I hope something I shared helps you recognize your own opportunities for this particular kind of wise, loving silence, and gives you the discernment to distinguish between truths that genuinely deserve voicing and truths better carried quietly, out of love rather than fear. Take care of yourselves, my friends. Speak honestly when honesty serves love, and practice silence, just as deliberately, when silence serves it even better. Until next time, this has been Eternal Flame Wisdom. Stay wise, stay discerning, and remember, sometimes the deepest love is the sentence we choose, quietly and deliberately, never to say aloud. Thank you for watching.